Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel Get Cozy, or welcome if you're new here. You might notice that my desk situation is different. I did get a new desk and I'm still trying to figure out the lighting situation, so bear with me on that. Now, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about these two pens here. Now, at first glance, these are the same pen, right? These are both Pilot Custom A23s. The difference is the nibs. So this is my husband's and he has a soft medium nib on this pen. Hopefully you can see the stamp there. And then the other one is my personal Pilot Custom A23, and this one has a standard Pilot medium nib. So in today's video, I'm going to be comparing these two nibs and see, is there really a difference between them? Online, public perception seems to hold these soft nibs higher in comparison to the standard Pilot nibs, mostly because people say that this nib is bouncier, more cushiony. Some people say that it's a flex-like nib. I hesitate to say that myself, but because it tends to be more bouncier, people say that there's more sheening associated with writing with this pen in comparison to the medium nib. Now, other people say that they prefer the standard nib because it's just a little bit more predictable, easier to control, and because it's less wet, it's more practical for daily use. So I'm going to be doing some writing comparisons on camera, and then at the end of this video, I will tell you about my opinion as to which one I prefer, what I think the best use cases are for them, if there's even a difference at all. But first, let me tell you a little bit about why the soft nib line even exists from Pilot. So originally, the flexible, softer style nibs from Pilot were designed to mimic traditional Japanese writing. So the brush that was used for this is called fude. That's the calligraphy brush. And you might be familiar with this pen here. This is a Tombow Fudenosuke dual tip brush pen, and it was designed for calligraphy. Fude translates to brush, Nosuke translates to help. So Fudenosuke roughly translates to a brush that helps. Now, Japanese calligraphy brushstrokes tend to have thicker downstrokes and thinner crossstrokes using pressure and wrist motion. And in the early 20th century, European fountain pens became more popularized, but they did not simulate those brushstroke dynamics because the nibs were very firm and rigid. So in 1918, Pilot, the company, was founded, and at the time, their nibs were just like the others, rigid and firm and made of gold. In the 20s, they began experimenting with some more flexible styles to mimic Japanese calligraphy dynamics a bit more. And in the 1970s, they came out with the Ilabo, also known as the Namiki Falcon. This is a pen that features a nib that has a beak shape, and it's designed to yield under vertical pressure. So you can see in this image here that the downstroke is thicker and the crossstrokes are thinner. And then eventually, in the early 1990s, the Pilot Custom 74 was introduced as part of its 74th anniversary celebration. And this pen came with a variety of nib options, including your standard extra fine, fine, medium, but also they came with soft nib versions of these. They were more bouncy than the standard nibs. The soft nibs have thinner gold profiling towards the tines, and so this allows them to give under pressure and mitigate shock as you're writing. And the idea behind this was to reduce hand fatigue. So for longer writing sessions, if you have a rigid nib and you press down, the resistance is pressed directly back into your hand, causing hand fatigue. Whereas when you have a softer nib, you have a little bit more cushion, and theoretically, you won't get fatigued as quickly. The second thing in mind with a soft nib is the way that ink flows in shades. So because the tines give a little bit more under pressure, they separate slightly and more ink comes out at a time, it tends to result in a juicier, wetter writing experience, giving more sheening opportunities with the ink that you're using. As far as price goes, the soft and standard nibs actually are the same MSRP because they are the same 14 karat gold alloy. Now, the catch here is the Pilot Custom A23 does not come with a soft nib option, at least to my knowledge, but you can get the soft nib on other pens from Pilot. It's not uncommon to buy one pen for the nib and then swap it out. And so that's exactly what my husband did with this pen here. Originally, we got a Pilot Custom 743 with a soft medium nib, and this Pilot Custom A23 came with a standard fine nib. And because it has such a large ink capacity, my husband ended up swapping the nibs so that he would go through ink a little bit faster in this pen and he typically uses this pen for note taking at work, usually on rodeo paper, but he does say that it is very wet and juicy, so much so that he doesn't feel like he can use it in his Hobonichi Weeks, which has a very small real estate for writing. Now, I just have a standard medium nib on my Pilot Custom 823, and I find that it is a wet and juicy writer, but not too much to where I can't use it in my Hobonichi Weeks. So I found that distinction to be quite interesting. As far as public perception goes, there does seem to be a myth of flex associated with this. Now, this is not a flex nib, but instead you do get more of a springy, cushiony, plushy type of writing experience with a little bit more line variation than the standard nib. Soft equaling more sheen is the last thing that I really saw online. For people who are team standard nib, this nib is considered to be one of the best factory nibs on the market. So it's kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of situation. It's also glassy smooth, and because it is more rigid, you do have better writing control. It's less wet, so better behaved on finicky paper and also for tiny writing. So this is the public perception I've seen online. We will talk about those points here shortly. Okay, so let's look at the nibs up close. Okay, so here are the nibs up close. The soft medium is on the left, the medium is on the right. Now, the nibs look identical, at least to my eyes, except for that stamping denoting soft versus standard. The tines are supposed to have thinner amount of metal on the soft medium, which is on the left side. To my eyes, I don't really see a difference visually. And then as far as the tipping material goes, again, I think they look pretty much identical. So there are differences in the nibs, but I think to the naked eye, it's a little bit difficult to detect those differences. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I am going to zoom you in and we are going to do some writing samples. Let me tell you about the paper that we're using. I'm going to start with some good Tomoe River paper in a Hobonichi A6 graph notebook. Then I'm going to use some Midori MD paper. I want to use these because I'm very familiar with both of these papers, and I think having a cream color versus a white color will be helpful in comparing sheening and shading between these two nibs. And then I also have a batch of bad Tomoe River paper in this Konzo Noto notebook. This notebook is prone to feathering, bleed through, things like that. And so I want to see if the standard medium nib behaves better on this paper compared to the supposedly juicier, wetter, soft medium nib. I'm hoping that we'll be able to see a difference. These are going to be the papers that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a close-up writing sample on the Tomoe River paper first. I will talk about it, and then I will do writing samples on the other two notebooks afterwards. And then after I finish those writing samples, we will discuss the results. So let's do some writing. Okay, so first let's just see what the nibs look like writing up close. I have the standard medium nib here first. Pilot, custom, 823. The standard medium nib. Oh, by the way, I have these inked with Orochizuku Tsukio. I just feel like this ink tends to have really nice sheening and shading properties, and I want to compare that between the two pens. So this is the standard, like I said. Now, the standard nib is just, this is one of my favorite nibs of all time, honestly. It does really feel like writing with glass, especially with a ink that's very lubricated and wet. And this nib doesn't really have a ton of line variation, so maybe it's a little bit lighter and less wet on the cross strokes, because I do feel like when I do a vertical stroke, more ink comes out. But as far as line variation goes, I don't really think there's a whole lot of it. If I press down, the tines do open slightly, but I don't recommend doing that, honestly. Now let's compare with the soft medium nib. And honestly, the glassy smoothness is pretty similar, but this one does have a little bit more line variation. So I would say they are equally as smooth, to be honest. As far as the glide of the pen goes, it is the same, but it does have more line variation. I will show you a side by side in a second. I also do feel like there is more ink coming out of this pen. I do think that it is juicier and wetter and a little bit harder to control. So that's how they look. Now it's kind of hard to tell what the line thickness is like side by side. So let me do a comparison down here. You can see that when I add pressure, those tines do open up, and you don't have to add very much pressure at all. This is a medium. And then again, here is the standard medium. I will add pressure. Even when I do add pressure, the line width is not nearly as wide on the downstrokes. Okay, so something that I'm curious about is whether or not the soft medium nib really is juicier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a 10-second dry test on a writing sample. I'm going to smear it for both of the nibs, and then my prediction is that the soft medium nib is going to smear worse, and so that will tell me that it really is putting out more ink than the standard nib. So let's do that. I have an iPod here to be my stopwatch. So let's do a 10-second dry test. And then we're going to do the same thing for the soft medium. Okay, looking at both of these, it's kind of hard to tell. So I think this one is worse than the standard nib. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a 20-second dry test and see if that is a little bit more clear. Okay. I think that was pretty telling, actually. I could keep going on and on, but it does seem like the 20-second dry test, there is a pretty big difference here. Where the 20 was written, it seems like it dried pretty much almost completely by the time that I was finished. And then the 20-second dry test for the soft medium nib seemed to smear quite a bit more. So it does seem like there is potentially more ink coming out of the soft medium nib versus the standard medium nib. Now, as far as line width goes, let's do some tiny writing really quickly. So again, this is the soft medium. I'm going to do some tiny writing. This is about the size that I would use to write in my Hobonichi Weeks. And then here's the regular medium. Okay, let's do a close-up. So here are the loops and the cross strokes for the soft medium and the standard medium nib. Like I said, for the vertical strokes, they can be thicker. There is more line variation for the soft nib. As far as tiny writing goes, I do feel like you can do tiny writing with the soft medium, but you can see that the ink looks darker and more saturated. And based on the dry test, it does seem like the soft medium nib does put out noticeably more ink. And I've noticed this just playing with these pens on my own, so I'm not really surprised by this result. And because it does put out more ink, I do think that makes it a little bit harder for tiny writing, just more ink pulling on the page. I think that your letters are going to look a little bit more bold and blocky in comparison to having less ink. So I can see why my husband doesn't like using this pen in his Hobonichi Weeks. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do the exact same writing samples on Midori MD paper and then also on the Kanzo Noto notebook. And then at the end, we will see how these pens perform on all three papers. If there's really that big of a difference, we'll also check for feathering, bleed through, ghosting, things like that. So let's do the Midori MD paper next. Okay, so I have all of the writing samples. I forgot to add tiny writing for the two papers, so I did that off camera. Apologies. Okay, so let's take a close-up. I'm gonna bring in my light a little closer so that we can get a good sense of sheening. So this is the Tomoe River paper on a Hobonichi A6 graph notebook, and this is how things are looking. So as far as the dry test goes, I do think that the standard medium nib did dry a little faster than the soft medium nib, likely due to having less ink coming out of the nib at a time in comparison. I think that this is pretty notable. And then as far as the sheening and shading, they are pretty similar. I would say that the soft medium nib looks a little bit darker. So maybe the shading is actually a little bit more pronounced with the standard medium nib. You can see that kind of watercolor effect in the 2 and the 3. And as far as line crispiness goes, they are both looking very crispy. I don't see any feathering. I don't typically see much feathering at all on this paper, so that's really great. Let's look at the back. Ghosting looks the same. It doesn't really seem like one is better than the other. So the major differences that I see on this paper really is just the dry time and then maybe the saturation a little bit. And then we also talked about the line width and the line variation. Let's talk about the Midori MD paper next. All right, as far as the line crispiness goes for feathering, I would say that they are pretty similar. I'm not really seeing many differences. Usually on this paper, I do see like a tiny bit of fuzziness. It's not really feathering, it's just not super crisp. And so I would say it looks pretty similar for both. As far as saturation, shading, sheening, honestly, I feel like they are looking pretty similar. I don't really see a lot of sheen of this ink on this paper, to be honest. As far as the dry times go, I do think that the biggest difference here is the 10-second dry time. There's a lot less smearing for the standard medium nib compared to the soft medium nib. And then for the 20-second dry test, they're pretty similar. Now let's look at the back. I would say on the back, they're identical. The soft medium doesn't look like it has worse ghosting. There's no bleed through. Okay, and then finally, let's look at the very finicky Kanzo Noto notebook paper. Now, this paper, weirdly, actually, I find that ink dries pretty fast on this paper. So for the dry times, I would say that they're pretty comparable. Weirdly, I feel like there's less smearing on the soft medium nib. I'm not really sure why that is, but they're pretty similar. Both look exactly the same for the 20-second dry test. As far as feathering goes, I do think that there is a subtle difference here. So for the standard medium nib, I don't really see very much feathering. There is a little bit. You can see the bottom of that too. Has a little bit of feathering, a little bit in the tiny writing, but mostly looks pretty good. For the soft medium, it also looks good for the most part, but I think that the feathering is a little bit more noticeable. And so that would be consistent with this nib just having a little bit more ink coming out of it. You can also see it on the cross strokes. They're kind of similar. I don't know. They're pretty close, but I think the soft medium might just be a tiny bit worse. Okay, this is interesting. This bottom writing section looks like the ghosting is much worse than the top. There's definitely darker ghosting, more propensity for bleed through. Is that just me or do you agree? Yeah, I definitely think the soft medium nib has worse ghosting and bleed through issues than the standard medium. So that does answer the question as to whether, whether the standard medium nib is better on poorer quality paper. Okay, so let's sum up these differences. One is the softness versus the firmness. The soft nib definitely feels softer. Now, it's not as bouncy and springy as a Pelican in 1000 nib. This nib really is very springy, very bouncy. I would describe the soft nib from Pilot to be more plushy and cushiony. It's really fun to write with in that regard, and because it does have that softness, you do get a little bit more line variation. Hopefully you are able to see that in the writing samples where you do have some thicker downstrokes whenever you add a little bit of pressure. I also think that because it's a softer nib, it can be a little bit more difficult for me to control my handwriting. So the reason why I did print and cursive for the writing sample is I was trying to see how it felt to write in both writing styles. I did feel like print was harder to write with the soft medium nib compared to the standard medium nib. I just think that's a little bit more difficult to control my handwriting, but that's kind of a minor thing. Now, as far as the way that the ink color looked, the sheening and the shading, I think that the shading is pretty similar. Same with the ink color and saturation. If anything, I think the most notable difference was with some of the tiny writing, especially on the Tomoe River paper, which we kind of talked about already, but the tiny writing looks a little bit more saturated with the soft medium nib versus the regular medium nib, and I think it's just because more ink is coming out of the soft medium nib, and that's just a little bit more noticeable on tiny writing. So that's really the biggest difference. I think both have very similar sheening. That being said, I'm using this one ink today. Maybe with other inks, sheening is more obvious in the soft medium, but for this ink specifically, I didn't really notice a difference in sheening. Now, the next thing was the dry test. I do think that it takes a little bit longer for writing from the soft medium nib to dry. We saw that with the Hobonichi notebook. We see it with the Midori notebook as well. And then for the Kanzo Nono notebook, I would say it's pretty similar for both. When I write on this paper in the Kanzo Nono notebook, the writing tends to dry pretty quickly. It really does feel like a sponge kind of sucking up the ink. So I think that's why there's not really a big difference here. But you can definitely see that for the Midori MD paper, there's a pretty big difference in terms of the smearing. So soft medium nib does put out more ink, so it's going to take longer time for it to dry than the standard medium. And then finally, the performance. Across the board, it was mostly the same, especially when it comes to feathering, line crispiness. On the Midori MD paper and the Tomoe River paper in the Hobonichi notebook, the ghosting was pretty much identical, no bleed through, but the Kanzo Noto notebook is where I noticed the biggest difference. There's a tiny bit more feathering with the soft medium nib, not really that noticeable, but I do think that the ghosting and bleed through is where there were some bigger issues with the soft medium nib compared to the standard medium. Now, this isn't paper that I would normally use fountain pens on, and if you're a fountain pen user, you're hopefully using paper that is less finicky. But if you ever are needing to write on lower quality paper or printer paper or something like that, I think you're going to have more issues with the soft medium nib just because it does put out more ink. Okay, so what are my personal thoughts, preferences? Do I really think it's worth it to go out of your way to get a soft medium nib? I think that's really just going to depend on what you are wanting to use it for. For me, I got a Pilot Custom A23 to be more of like a daily driver pen. I wanted to be able to use it for note-taking, journaling, and also my Hobonichi weeks. And so because of that, I want to have flexibility for tiny writing and also to write in print because in my Hobonichi weeks, I tend to write in print and really small. And I do find that it works really well for that. I did use it on this spread in my Hobonichi weeks with another Uroshizuku ink, and I do feel like the tiny writing and the print looks really legible. I didn't think it was too wet. So for me personally, I do really like using this for all of those use cases, and it checks the boxes that I really needed. I do think that with the soft medium nib, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. And my husband does attest to the fact that he thinks it's too wet to use in his Hobonichi weeks, and tiny writing is more difficult. So for me, I do prefer the standard medium nib for those reasons, but I do think it depends on what you're getting the pen for. So I would recommend choosing the type of nib based on the use case that you have in mind. The soft nib is really fun, but I do think that it's going to be a little bit less beginner friendly and a little bit less practical. And the standard medium nib, I think you'll be able to use for more use cases, but again, that's kind of personal preference. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Now, if you're somebody who has multiple fountain pens and you are looking for a pen that's a little bit softer, has a little bit more of an interesting writing experience, I think the soft nib is a really fun way to go. It is more fun to write with, I would say, than the standard medium nib, but it also has the downsides of being a little bit harder to control, the dry time taking a little bit longer, and not being as practical for some of the use cases that I need out of the pen. So what is my preference? For me, I prefer the standard medium nib, but I don't really think you could go wrong with either. So those are my thoughts with the soft medium versus the standard medium nibs from Pilot. There are definitely some differences. I would love to know if you agree with my observations and my opinions. Have you used a soft nib from Pilot? Do you also think that it's very different on their standard nibs. I would also love to know if you have a soft fine or a soft fine medium, are you able to use it for tiny writing or in something really small like a Hobonichi Weeks? Leave your comments down below. I would love to read them. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I'm going to leave you here. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!